The night smelled of old rain and gasoline. A lonely street, streetlights flickering as if the world held its breath. The thief watched from the corner, an old woman locking up her small store. No one else around, only the whisper of the wind, and three silent engines in the dark like sleeping lions. When he took his first step, thinking it would be an easy night, he didn't know those engines weren't sleeping. They were waiting. Stay till the end, because this story proves brotherhood is louder than fear.
From the other side of the street, through a veil of mist and exhaust fumes, three motorcycles appeared, their engines idling like caged thunder, their headlights cutting through the drizzle with the fierce, unwavering glow of predatory eyes. The sound wasn't loud yet. It was a slow, low rumble that crawled under the skin, the kind of noise that carried weight, authority, and warning. The boy froze. The knife in his hand began to tremble, not from cold, but from the sudden awareness that he was no longer alone in this night. The fog swirled around him like smoke from a confession he hadn't made yet. He turned slightly, his heart punching at his ribs, trying to understand who or what had come for him. The riders said nothing. They didn't need to. Their silence was louder than words, their stillness heavier than any threat. They just stood there, the rain sliding down their jackets, the chrome of their bikes glinting in the dying light of the street lamps. Each exhalation of exhaust rose into the air like a warning flare, then disappeared into the night. The old woman, still gripping the counter for balance, could feel the vibration of those engines pulsing through the floorboards, each beat like a promise of justice waiting to unfold. She didn't understand who they were, only that they belonged to a different kind of law. One of them stepped forward, a giant with a gray beard, leather vest darkened by rain, and eyes that carried the calm of someone who had seen too much to ever fear again. His boots echoed against the wet pavement as he approached, slow and deliberate, each step cutting through the tension like a countdown. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep, steady, and carved from years of command. "Sure you want to keep going, son?" The words didn't come as a threat. They came as a question, heavy with warning, almost merciful in tone. The boy swallowed hard, the knife now useless in his shaking hand. His breath came short and uneven, the sound of his own heartbeat drowning out everything else. The wind picked up, rattling the metal chains that hung over the store's door, making them clang like distant bells. The old woman's knees wavered beneath her, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath, suspended between violence and mercy. The moment stretched endlessly, a fragile balance between darkness and redemption. And somewhere in that silence, the road itself seemed to listen.
The three riders exchanged a glance, brief, silent, and heavy with meaning. The kind of look shared by men who didn't need to speak to understand one another. It wasn't a plan, it wasn't a vote, it was instinct, a code written somewhere deeper than blood. In that single moment, everything that needed to be decided already was. They weren't heroes. Heroes chased glory. They weren't saints. Saints sought forgiveness. They were something in between. Men who carried the weight of their pasts like chains, and yet still drew invisible lines in the dirt between right and wrong. And tonight, that line had been crossed in front of them. The boy's hand went limp. The knife slipped from his grasp and hit the ground with a dull clatter, its echo swallowed by the rain. The sound felt final, like a curtain falling. The leader stepped forward, his boots splashing through puddles, his presence filling the space with quiet authority. He bent down, picked up the knife, and studied it for a moment. The blade caught the reflection of his face, a face carved by time, smoke, and road dust, and for an instant his eyes softened. "You weren't born bad," he said finally, his voice low and rough, like gravel sliding over steel. "You just lost your way." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, heavy, unpolished, real. Then he turned, not toward the boy, but away from him, and offered his hand to the old woman, still trembling beside the counter. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then took it. His glove was cold, but his grip was steady, grounding her in the chaos that had just begun to fade. Behind them, the other two riders stood motionless, engines still rumbling in the distance, like the pulse of something greater than men, the heartbeat of the road itself. If you believe loyalty still has meaning, subscribe to Hell's Road, because stories like this are far from over. The boy didn't move. He couldn't. His whole body seemed to lock in place, caught between fear and something that felt uncomfortably like shame. He had expected fists, boots, or rage, the kind of punishment he thought he deserved. But what he found instead was respect, quiet, unwavering, undeserved, and that cut deeper than any blade ever could. For a moment, as the rain softened and the engines began to fade, he realized that mercy, true mercy, was louder than violence. And that night, on a forgotten street under a flickering light, he met a kind of justice that didn't wear a badge, but rode on two wheels. By the time the flashing red and blue lights washed over the wet pavement, the bikers were already gone. No engines, no roar, no trace of their presence except for the faint echo that still trembled in the air, like a heartbeat refusing to die. The rain kept falling, relentless and cold, turning puddles into mirrors that reflected only emptiness. The police officers found no witnesses, no suspects, only the quiet aftermath of something that felt less like a crime and more like a warning delivered by ghosts of the highway. On the cracked asphalt, just outside the old market door, lay a single patch, soaked,
frayed at the edges, its colors muted by the rain. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of an entire creed. Ride with honor, protect the weak. Margaret bent down slowly, her knees trembling, her old fingers brushing against the wet fabric with the same care someone might use to lift a relic from a sacred place. She didn't know who they were or why they had come, but she knew, deep in her chest, that this small piece of leather was more than decoration. It was a promise, a message left behind by men who still believed in things the world had long forgotten: loyalty, respect, and quiet justice. As the patrol cars rolled away and the rain softened to a mist, Margaret stood under the flickering light of the store sign, the patch clutched tightly in her hands. For the first time in years, she felt safe, not because the danger had passed, but because somewhere out there, someone was watching over her. That same night, far down the highway, where neon lights hummed above a forgotten diner and the smell of coffee and oil mixed in the air, 3 men sat in silence. Their jackets steamed gently from the rain, and their patches, the same design as the one Margaret now held, caught the dull glow of the bar's light. They didn't speak about what happened. They didn't need to. Justice, for them, wasn't something you explained. It was something you carried out, then left behind for others to feel.
Cole, the leader, stirred his coffee without drinking it, eyes lost somewhere beyond the window, where headlights came and went like passing ghosts. The road was calling again, as it always did, endless, cold, and honest. One of the men lit a cigarette. Another adjusted the leather on his vest. None of them smiled, yet there was peace in the silence, the kind that only men who live by a code can understand. They carry their colors like armor, symbols of loyalty stitched in leather. You can carry that same spirit. Our official Hell's Road gear is linked below for those who live by the code. The neon sign outside flickered one last time before dying completely, leaving only the reflection of their motorcycles lined up under the rain, patient, waiting, alive. And when they finally stood to leave, the sound of their boots echoed like a quiet oath across the floorboards. Out there, the world had forgotten what honor looked like, but on the road, it still wore leather. 2 nights later, when the streets were once again swallowed by silence and the sky hung low with the weight of unfallen rain, the boy returned. He came quietly, walking the same cracked sidewalk where everything had gone wrong, his footsteps echoing softly against the empty storefronts. There was no knife in his pocket this time, no anger burning behind his eyes, only a small paper bag held tightly in his hands, warm from the bakery down the road. Inside were simple things: bread, milk, and the fragile hope of forgiveness. He stopped at the door of the old market, the same one he had once tried to rob, and for a long moment he just stood there, unsure of what to do. The window still bore a faint crack from where he had pressed his hand that night, and the flickering sign above still buzzed with its tired light. The world hadn't changed, but he had. He knelt slowly, placing the bag by the door, and then stepped back into the shadows. The air was cold, smelling faintly of oil and rain. He waited, No words rehearsed, no excuses prepared, only silence. Inside, Margaret moved carefully across the floor, her old slippers whispering against the wood. She had grown used to quiet nights since the incident, though sometimes she still thought she could hear the faint echo of engines beyond the hills. When she opened the door and saw the bag sitting in the glow of the streetlight, her breath caught. She looked around, expecting the same fear to rise, but it didn't come. What replaced it instead was something softer, surprise, and beneath it, understanding. Out on the road, maybe 30 yards away, 3 motorcycles stood idling, their engines steady and deep, purring like distant thunder held in restraint. The riders didn't move. They didn't need to. Their presence said everything that words could not. They weren't there to threaten or to remind the boy of what he had done. They were there to witness what he was becoming. The leader, Cole, raised his hand slowly, a single silent nod that carried the weight of a verdict, not of guilt, but of grace. The boy met his gaze from afar, his chest tightening with something he hadn't felt in years: peace. He lowered his head, almost in reverence, and then the engines revved once, a sound not of power, but of acknowledgement, and began to fade into the distance, swallowed by the wind and the rhythm of the road. Margaret stood there watching, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding the small bag against her chest. The rain began to fall again, gentle this time, washing the dust from the pavement, from the memory of what had been. Redemption doesn't speak, it acts. And that night, on a forgotten street at the edge of the city, it had finally spoken, louder than sin.
When it was finally over, when the engines had faded into memory, when the last raindrops had disappeared into the cracks of the pavement, and the night surrendered to the slow bleeding light of dawn, the 3 bikers rode once more into the open road. The horizon was painted in soft shades of gray and silver, like the world itself was waking from a long dream. The road stretched endlessly before them, wet and glimmering, carrying the reflections of a world that still slept. The wind carried the faint smell of rain, oil, and redemption, the perfume of those who live without asking for forgiveness, but who still find it along the way. Their engines hummed in perfect rhythm, a deep, steady growl that spoke louder than any words could. They didn't talk, because there was nothing left to say. What had been done needed no retelling. Each man carried it in silence, not as a burden, but as a truth, simple and unspoken, like the hum of the tires against the road. Justice for them had never been about laws or witnesses. It was about balance, about making sure that in a world that had forgotten decency, someone still remembered how to care. Cole rode in front, his shoulders broad beneath the worn leather jacket, the club's insignia darkened by rain. His eyes, hidden behind scratched aviator lenses, looked straight ahead, but his thoughts lingered in the rear-view mirror. There, framed by the fading night and the soft breath of dawn, was the tiny market they had left behind. Its old wooden sign swayed gently in the morning breeze, and in the doorway stood a figure, small, fragile, yet unbroken. Margaret Lee, wrapped in a blanket, lifted one trembling hand toward the road, the gesture slow but full of quiet gratitude. Cole saw her for only a moment. He couldn't hear her words if there were any, but he didn't need to. That image, a solitary woman standing in the light of her rebuilt peace, was enough. He nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion, and turned his gaze back to the horizon. He knew he'd never come back, never pass that street again, and that was fine. Some stories are meant to end where they began, leaving behind nothing but silence and a reminder that good still exists in the corners of the world most people choose to ignore. The morning light spread across the landscape, painting the clouds in silver and pale gold. The world was empty, save for the steady rhythm of 3 engines slicing through the mist, carrying with them the kind of peace that follows after storms. The road ahead looked endless, a ribbon of steel and promise stretching into the unknown. And Cole felt something in his chest loosen, not joy, not sorrow, but acceptance. He reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror one last time. The reflection of the market grew smaller until it disappeared completely. Ahead, the sky was opening, vast and colorless, and the only sound left was the beating pulse of the highway beneath their tires. In that moment, he realized that sometimes protecting someone without asking for anything in return isn't just an act of mercy, it's an act of remembrance, a way to remind yourself that even men who live in the shadows can still be the light for someone else.
They rode in silence for miles. The only sound, the wind whipping against their jackets, and the deep, steady thunder of the engines that never seemed to tire. The other 2 riders followed close behind, forming a line that cut cleanly through the dawn, like an oath etched into the horizon. None of them looked back. The past, after all, wasn't something they carried. It was something they left behind, piece by piece, mile after mile, knowing the road would remember for them. Some roads lead to redemption, others to memory. If you want to keep the fire alive, the official Hell's Road store is linked below, where brotherhood lives beyond the story. The sun finally broke through the clouds, soft at first, then bright and golden, spilling across the asphalt and catching on the chrome of their motorcycles. For a moment, it looked as though they were riding straight into the light itself, their silhouettes long and weightless against the gray morning sky. The sound of the engines rose and fell like breathing, a living, moving prayer that carried with it every story the world had forgotten. The old woman would go on with her days, the boy would rebuild what he'd broken, and the bikers would keep riding toward nowhere, guided by something only they could hear. The road doesn't forgive and it doesn't forget, but for those who live by its code, that's enough. And as the wind swallowed their figures and the horizon claimed them whole, the message they left behind lingered like the echo of thunder on an empty highway. Brotherhood never dies. It just rides on.
Days later, when the storm had already dissolved into memory, and the scent of rain no longer lingered in the air, the young man found himself walking down that same street again, the place where his life had almost taken a turn from which there is no return. The cracked sidewalk still bore the same stains of oil and time. The flickering lamppost still hummed faintly, and the small market still stood there like an old survivor refusing to surrender to decay. Nothing had changed, and yet, somehow, everything had. He walked slower this time, not out of fear, but out of reverence, for the place, for the woman, for the version of himself he had left behind. In his hands he carried no weapon, no mask of anger or defiance, just a quiet determination and a paper bag filled with small things that mattered more than he would ever admit. Apples, bread, and a carton of milk. Simple things, the kind that make life feel human again. When he reached the door, he didn't hesitate. He didn't need to. Margaret was already outside, struggling to lift 2 heavy grocery bags from the curb. For a moment, they both froze, the air between them heavy with the ghosts of what had once been fear. But the past, that night, felt far away, like a storm that had already passed over them and left only clean sky behind. He stepped forward quietly. "Let me help you," he said, his voice low, careful, unsure. The old woman looked at him for a long second, and in her eyes there was no anger, no suspicion, no trace of the trembling that had once filled them. There was only understanding, the kind that comes from people who have lived long enough to recognize a soul that's trying to start again. She nodded once, gently, and handed him the bags. As they walked together toward the door, the world seemed to breathe again. The morning light spread through the gray clouds, soft and forgiving. The street that had once been cold and cruel now felt alive, as if the city itself had chosen to let go of its bitterness for a moment. When their eyes met again, neither spoke. They didn't need to. Some wounds don't close with words. They close with actions, quiet and steady, repeated over time until they become peace. Later that afternoon, as the young man walked away, he stopped at the corner and turned his head slightly. In the distance, the faint sound of a motorcycle engine drifted through the wind, a low, familiar rumble rolling down the empty road like a memory refusing to fade. He closed his eyes and listened. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. He smiled, not because he expected to see them again, but because he finally understood. Some lessons don't come from books or laws. They come from moments like that night, when the world shows you what real strength looks like. He knew now that justice doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes it wears leather, scarred, weathered, and faithful to the road. And as he walked on, the sound of that distant engine blended with the wind, carrying with it the quiet promise that somewhere out there, beneath the same sky, those riders were still moving, not for glory, not for vengeance, but for something far greater, the unspoken duty to keep the fire of brotherhood alive, mile after mile, soul after soul. This was one of many forgotten legends of the road. Subscribe to Hell's Road and ride with us into the next story.